Political correctness is not primarily something that the state does. In this case, the state is more jumping on the bandwagon once the train is already in motion. So later on, you had the growth in the diversity industry, you had politicians trying to show, I'm a good person, I care about victim groups, and therefore I hire 100 diversity officers here. But that's a relatively recent phenomenon, and even so, the number of people who take part in politically correct witch hunts is vastly greater than the number of people who could ever work in say, for an employment tribunal or in some bureaucracy that is somehow about creating diversity. It's just not big enough to be explained in that way. Now, having said that, I still think you can explain political correctness indirectly by using your Econ 101 textbook, but not in the narrow sense of just appealing to self-interest. I think it makes much more sense to think of politically correct opinions as a form of status symbol. So a politically correct opinion is a marker of social status. The idea that people use political ideas to express status, to communicate something about themselves, is not novel at all. It's actually something that you've all come across in one way or another. Just imagine you are at some event and you meet two people who you've never met before. And let's say you know nothing about their social background. You don't know what type of education they have, how much they earn, what social class they are in. Let's say they dress in a completely class-neutral way, talk in a class-neutral way. You can't say anything about them. And now, for some reason, your conversation turns to politics. And one of them starts moaning about genetically modified food or about the power of big supermarkets. And the other one starts moaning about foreigners coming here and taking the jobs of British workers. Even if you know nothing about these people, you would immediately draw conclusions about their social background. Why? Well, because moaning about GM food is a high status opinion. It's an opinion that is associated with high levels of education, maybe intelligence, maybe to a lesser extent wealth. And moaning about immigration is considered a low status opinion, has a whiff of Daily Mail. It's the sort of view that even if you secretly agree with it, you wouldn't parade it in polite society because you know exactly what connotations that would have. And just to be clear here, I'm not suggesting that people who express high status opinions are just doing that out of opportunism. I'm not saying that this is just pure signaling, that people are being opportunistic and lying, that they secretly believe something else. That's not my argument at all. I'm fairly convinced that people who express high status views at that moment really do believe it. But I'd rather say it's more like the fact that we perceive certain styles, certain ways of dressing or of talking or of particular styles of music as tacky, and we perceive others as classy. Why? There's nothing inherently tacky or inherently classy about any way of dressing. If somebody arrived from a different planet, they wouldn't know why we think of a character like Vicky Pollard as being dressed in a tacky way. That's very much something that only, or even a time traveler from 100 years ago wouldn't understand that, why we all have this association. But the fact is, you perceive it in that way because you know that other people do it too. And so it is with political opinions. And if there are opinions that are considered high status and you know it, and the others are low status and you know it, that will somehow cloud and affect your judgment as well. That will make you more sympathetic to trying to find truth in the high status opinions and trying to find fault in low status opinions. And in that way, I think people gravitate towards politically correct views, because they are an extreme example of high status views in certain settings, certainly in academia, large parts of the media. A politically correct opinion would be a marker of a high social status. It would be a way of expressing that you are a sophisticated, well-educated, right-on person, and you gain social approval for saying that. And in that way, a politically correct opinion is very much like a Rolex watch. It's something that you use not for its practical value. It's not that you use the Rolex watch because it shows you the time. A 10 pence clock could also show you the time. No, you use it to express something about yourself. And that is, if once you start thinking about politically correct views in that way, a number of things that otherwise seem illogical suddenly start making sense. So this phenomenon that I alluded to earlier, why would somebody bang on about sexism, bang on about homophobia in contexts where these phenomena are really very rare, but at the same time excuse them or try to explain them away in instances where they are actually quite frequent? Well, it makes sense if you think of it as a status signaling activity, because there is no social status to be gained for saying there are homophobic incidents in Tower Hamlets. But if you say there are homophobic incidents at your university, then you go up in the social ranking. And once you start thinking about it and looking at it through that lens, as a lot of behaviors that otherwise would seem irrational suddenly make a lot of sense. And I think that's the mistake that a lot of clever people on the left are making. People like Nick Cohen, who wrote this book about 10 years ago, What's Left, in which he wrote about why people on the left profess that they are concerned about victimhood, but then make excuses for, or while they're banging on about relatively trivial cases, at the same time they're willing to make excuses for much more severe cases when they occur within a minority community. And Nick Cohen is furious about that, because he takes these politically correct arguments at face value, and if you do that, it seems illogical that you would, for example, excessively police a university for politically incorrect behavior, because a Western university campus is probably the most politically correct place in the world that you could think of. There's no place outside of a Western university campus where you will find so much sensitivity to these issues, and yet those are also places of very intense monitoring, inward monitoring, and that's something that makes no sense if you take these people's claims at face value, because that would then be like, imagine you are an anti-alcohol campaigner and you have limited funds. You can campaign in a neighborhood where people have a pint every week, an occasional pint, and here you have an area where almost everybody is a heavy drinker. Which of these two areas do you focus your resources on? Well, if you think logically, of course, you go for the heavy drinker area. Even if you are a teetotaler, even if you think nobody should ever drink a drop of alcohol, you would still say, yeah, I'm not happy about these occasional drinkers, but clearly my priorities at the moment are the heavy drinkers, and I have limited resources. I have to target my resources on that group. And social justice warriors that dedicate 99% of their time to what is now called microaggressions and phenomena like somebody complimenting somebody on their profile picture on LinkedIn, and that becoming a national story. Somebody saying this is a stunning picture, and that becoming an egregious example of sexism and objectification and so forth. While at the same time, there are communities which are genuinely traditionalist and patriarchal, and social justice warriors would never even talk about it. It makes sense once you think about it in those terms in which I've described it, as status signaling, not concern for victim groups.